I'm not entirely certain. Giving you all a bunch of sugary treats and the children chocolate was the best idea. But we'll get through it. All right. Now, as we read the scripture this morning, like I said at the beginning, that's probably the story you expect to hear, which of course is the Easter story, which is the story of Jesus' resurrection. What may be a little unexpected is where it is that we stopped reading this morning. Because if you noticed, what's not included in Mark's version of the story is actually anybody seeing Jesus. What gets even weirder is if you go, and most of the translations you have today will point out that where we stopped reading is where the most original versions of Mark stop. You sometimes will find some additional endings on the Gospel of Mark that include a little bit more, but we know pretty well through scholarship today that those all came later. That the most original version of Mark that we have ends where we ended, and that is, on the face of it, a really weird place to end, right? That's not where you expect the story to end. Like they ran away and then that's it? Huh? Well, if you know anything about Mark, one of the things we've talked about a lot in here is that we have four Gospels because the four Gospels are four different perspectives on the same set of events and are also speaking to four different audiences. Mark is the oldest Gospel we have. It was the one soonest written after Jesus' death. It's the shortest one that we have, and Mark really is like the action-adventure Gospel. Everything happens very quickly in Mark's Gospel, and Mark's favorite word of all words is immediately. There are so many places there where say Jesus did this, and then immediately Jesus did that. Jesus was apparently really loved his coffee. I don't know. But Jesus was plenty sugared up as far as I can tell, because in Mark's versions, he's always going and doing. Now, the other thing that is unique about Mark's version is Mark assumes that we already know, for the most part, what's going on. He doesn't include any sort of birth story. He doesn't tell us anything about where Jesus comes from. He doesn't even really introduce Jesus if you go to chapter 1. John the Baptist just shows up, and we're supposed to apparently already know who he is. And then Jesus shows up, and we're apparently supposed to already know who he is as well. Now, since this was written only a short while after Jesus' death, it actually sort of makes sense. Everybody would already know. And throughout Mark's gospel, he actually has a really interesting purpose to it in that Jesus really actually isn't. What Jesus does and what Jesus says and how he acts in many places is not actually the primary thing Mark is concerned about. What Mark is concerned about is how the people around him respond to Jesus. He cares deeply about how the disciples respond to what Jesus does. He cares deeply about how the culture and the community around them responds to what Jesus does. And I will give you a little hint, they don't always respond well. In fact, sometimes not at all. So in that light, it's not a surprise that Mark ends where he ends, because for him, the important part is not necessarily the fact that Jesus was raised, because everybody already knew that. It wasn't that Jesus came back and talked to the disciples, because everybody already knew that. What he wanted to capture and highlight at the end was the response that the women had to learning some very unexpected news. And they did not necessarily respond how we might have thought they should respond. Because at this point, these women had been around Jesus for a long time. They'd heard Jesus talk. They heard him say what he was going to say. And yet, despite all of that, when they reach the tomb and it's empty, they are surprised. And they're not only surprised, but they're scared. And at a certain point, I think we can all kind of relate to that. Because they had an idea. The disciples and everybody had an idea about what was supposed to happen and what was going to happen, right? And it wasn't this. Though Jesus told them many times that it probably wasn't going to necessarily work out well for him. He told them many times that the people were going to come for him. It's clear that the disciples and those around Jesus never really believed it because they didn't want to believe it. Because so long as Jesus was there and Jesus was leading and they could follow what he was doing and everything he was doing was amazing, that was a really great and amazing place to be. How awesome would it be to travel around with a guy who can, take somebody's sack lunch and turn it into food for 5,000 people, right? Who can heal people on command, who can turn water into wine. That's a great trick. I think there's days we all wish we could do that. How good would that have been? Nicely done. All right. How good? There's actually a hot button back there for that if you don't know. All right. Man. All right. So, but it would have been a good experience, right? People were coming to see Jesus. People respected him, right? Not just a week ago was there that parade in where people were laying stuff down in front of him. They did not want to believe that Jesus would leave, because if Jesus left, that means things were going to have to change, and they didn't want things to change. So despite how many times he told them, it's very, very clear that the disciples and those around Jesus didn't believe it because they didn't want to believe it. And yet, it happens anyway. So you can imagine, only a couple of days before, do they see Jesus taken away from them, and not only taken away from them in a really horrendous way. There's not too much worse a way to go than to be hung on a cross. So they're still reeling from that. It's only been a short time, and then they go, and then something else changes again, because what they expect to find, which is what they expect to find, of course, is Jesus and Jesus' body. They don't find that, and then they find out that yet again, what they expect to happen isn't happening and something else is. So you can forgive them. I think we all can forgive them for their response, where they basically throw up their hands and go, well, great, now what? And if we're honest, we've all had that experience, right? Because we all like to plan out where things are going, and we all like to think we know where our life is going, and we really don't like it. This is a kind of standard human trait. We don't really like it when something comes and messes up our plans, right? Especially if that thing that messes it up is something that in and of itself feels like a tragedy. And of course, the death of Jesus no doubt felt like a tragedy to them. So we cannot complain, and we cannot hold these folks to to a standard that we ourselves know we don't meet. Because when we have a plan and we know where we feel like we know where life is going, and we have an expectation of what's going to happen tomorrow, next week, and next year, most of us do not respond well, myself included, when something changes. Now, at the end of this month, towards the end of this month, we're actually going to start a book study that a friend of mine named John Edgar wrote. I've talked about it a little bit before. I got to know John when I was still in seminary back in Columbus. And I actually only met him one time at an event he was hosting at his ministry, and I said a few words to him. And then a week later, he called me, kind of out of the blue. He says, hey, I have this idea. I'm like, okay, John. He's like, there's these two small churches near me. They're really, really struggling. And I'm wondering if you and another student wouldn't want to come down here and be student pastors at these churches. Now, at this point, already uprooting my life and changing careers and moving my family to the wrong side of the Mississippi River in Ohio. We belong on this side. Was already disruptive enough. And when we got there, we had a plan for our 4 years and how we were going to spend it. And it did not include moving to South Columbus, 45 minutes away from my seminary, to be the student pastor at two small churches. I had actually already done my internship. I had checked that box. And John told me kind of what he was thinking and what his plan was. And I'm like, that sounds interesting. I don't know, maybe. But I was really hesitant to go. And it was actually a couple of friends of mine that really kind of ones who convinced me that this would be a good opportunity. You're going to learn so much. John's a great guy. You're going to learn so much from him. I don't know how you pass this down. It's a real honor that he's even asking you. And I'm like, yeah, he doesn't know me. He's just hoping I'm dumb enough to do it. That's what he thinks. And so long story short, we do end up going down there, which means moving down there and finding a place to live and all this sort of stuff. And so we get down there, and we start, all Methodist pastors usually start, July 1. So we start July 1 at these two little churches, and we're kind of like trying to figure out what we're doing the whole time, because me and another guy ended up going down and doing it. And we're trying to figure out what we're doing because we don't know what we're doing. We're brand new. We're only halfway through school. Right? And it's one of those moments you're like, really? You're going to leave me in charge? That doesn't seem wise. I don't know what I'm doing. And so we meet with John, and he, regularly, and he kind of tells us what's going on and what he thinks we should do. And shortly afterwards, we get to have a meeting with our superintendent, which is sort of the overseer of all the churches in that area. And during our little meeting, we finally say to him, like, hey, by the way, thanks for having us down here. What's the plan, right? Like, what do you want us to do? Because you haven't told us. And he's like, well, we just sort of thought that if we, put a young pastor there, maybe some other young people would show up. And thankfully, I held myself back from saying what I wanted to say, which is that's a stupid plan. Why do you think that would do that? Like, that's not going to happen. And well, you know what? It didn't. And so we kind of got through that summer. And by the way, that was summer of 2008. You might remember a little something happened fall 2008, where, the whole financial world ended. And the one thing that was the one thing that was consistent about where we were in South Columbus is that South Columbus was populated pretty much entirely by working class folks, a lot of them working in construction. There was no construction once the fall of 2008 hit. And I remember going to visit John in a pretty much panic, going, oh my God, what are we supposed to do now? Right? We had a food pantry that went from seeing like 30 people to seeing 90 people in the span of 1 week. We had a Wednesday night meal that we would just invite everybody in to eat. We went from, again, serving about 40 people to serving 150 people in a space that does not hold 150 people in the span of 1 week. And I was panicked. I did not know what to do. I didn't feel like I knew what I was doing. And I went and I talked to John, and I'm like, John, what do we do? And he's like, I think it'll be fine. And I'm like, easy for you to say. Not thinking that his own ministries, where he was working with similar people, were going through the roof. And it was then that John reminded me of something that he talked about all the time. And that was his idea of God's divine economy of abundance. And the one thing he talked about all the time, and that in God's world and how God sees the world, there's always enough. The question is only about getting stuff where it needs to go. But he believed 100% that there would always be enough, and somehow, no matter how hard it was, that if faithful people do faithful work, somehow God will help you find a way through. At the time, I thought he was full of it. Turns out, what I would learn in the following 2 years is that he was right. Because the one thing that we figured out is that while we were getting hit really hard, there were places that weren't. And even though we were struggling, there were places that wanted to help those who were struggling. And so we got on the phone and we started making phone calls to people we knew from other parts of town and said, hey, would you come down and help us out? We need people to serve food. We need people to donate food. We need to get this done. We need to get that one. And you know what? They came. And they came in spades. And by that time that 2 year was up, I learned a couple of important things. The most important thing I learned was that John was right, and that when faithful people do faithful work, somehow you find a way through. It may not be the way you expect to find a way through. It may not be the easiest thing you've ever done. In fact, quite often, it's quite hard. But the most important thing is that you find your faith and you find a way to do faithful work. That is often easier said than done. And most of us will find ourselves in the position, like the women at the empty tomb, where in that moment, their faith failed them. And yet, we know that while that's where Mark ends the story, that is not the end of the story. And it's not the end of the story for Jesus, it's not the end of the story for his disciples, and it's not the end of the story for the women. I think Mark tells us that story so we will have sympathy for them, and in a way have sympathy for ourselves. So that when we face those moments, or maybe our response to whatever is happening around us isn't as faithful as we know it should be or would like it to be, we can show ourselves the same grace that Jesus no doubt showed those women. We can show ourselves the same forgiveness that no doubt those women were forgiven. And we can recognize that we always have the opportunity to go back. We always have the opportunity to find the faith that we need. Now, this is one of those things that, as a Methodist, and a very kind of geeky Methodist, as most of you know, should have been ready to do, because actually this concept is actually embedded deep into what it is to be Methodist in the Methodist tradition. So John Wesley was the founder of Methodism when was it? I wrote it down. Look at me, how smart I am. In 1735, a long time ago, John Wesley was crossing the ocean to come be a missionary in Georgia. That missionary experience, by the way, would go very, very poorly, but that's a story for a different day. But on the trip over, on ships that looked nothing like the cruise ships we sail on today, they hit a big storm because, of course, they didn't have weather radar or GPS or any of those things. And it was a storm so big that it actually toppled the main mast of the ship. And John was fairly convinced that everybody on that boat, including himself, was going to die. And when he looked around, he saw something very interesting. He saw the people who were like him and from where he was were all in the same panic that he was, but there was this other group that was behaving rather differently. And it was a group of what was known as Moravians, which are basically a German group, a German religious group, who were also on the boat heading over. And he talked to them afterwards. It's like, you guys didn't seem to be panicking like the rest of us. And they said, no. I'm like, well, why? Weren't you afraid? And they said, no. And then because this is the 16th or 17th century, he then said, well, weren't your women and children afraid? Hey, come on. And he said, no. And he's like, why? It's like, we have faith. And it wasn't faith that they thought nothing was going to happen to them by any means. It wasn't the faith that said, oh, everything's always just going to be fine. It wasn't that. The faith that they had said, no matter what happens, we have faith that God is with us. And one way or another, in this life or next, God will see us through. That was the faith they had in that moment. So it led them to not panic, not freak out, and not run around like everybody else was. Now, when John would get back 3 years later, he, again, had an awful experience in Georgia. It went very, very poorly. He got back. His brother, who he loved, got sick. And he found himself in a place where he had a real strong crisis of faith, like many of us can sometimes have. He felt the world around him was not going the way that he wanted to. His life wasn't going the way that he wanted to. His ministry wasn't going the way that he wanted it to. And he was really questioning. The next day, he was scheduled to preach at a church, and he had no idea what he was going to do or what he was going to say. And he really was considering just canceling the whole thing. And he happened to run into somebody that he knows who was also part of that Moravian group. And he said, what should I do? Should I cancel? And he's like, absolutely not. He's like, well, what should I do then? Because I don't feel like I have faith in this moment. And he gives him this great line that John writes down in his journal. He says, you should preach faith until you have it. And then you should preach faith. And that became one of those lines that actually got deeply embedded into the Methodist movement, and something that John would reply over and over again when people were in similar crises, and that was the advice he would give over and over again. And it's something that, especially those of us who choose to do the silly task of standing up here, I remind myself of all the time, because I am like everybody else, and sometimes the world seems a bit out of hand, and I don't know what to do about it. And I am reminded of the idea that we must preach faith till we have it, and then preach faith. This would get deeply embedded into the Methodist Church, especially in the United States, where, when the country was new and expanding west, Methodists primarily decided to do something unique that almost nobody else did. Most of the other religious traditions of the day kind of hung out in the big cities, and as new cities were born, if they got big enough, then they would show up and they would build a church in those big cities. Methodism took a different route where they decided, hey, I know, let's put pastors on horseback, which I would never do. Horses are terrible. Sorry. I've been horsebacking twice. It was miserable both times. I know some of you like it, but you're weird. Anyway. But they would say, here's what we're going to do. Yeah, we're going to go out because we're moving west. Everything's moving west. We're building these more little towns west, and no one of those towns is big enough to support a church. But if you put 4 or 5 of them together, if you put them into a circuit and you give a pastor a horse and you say, ride between these churches, well, then maybe you do have enough folks. And what other religious traditions, other Christian traditions discovered when they finally decided to move west is that Methodists were already there. There was a time in the 1840s where Methodism was by far the biggest Christian tradition in the United States. Not in the big cities and towns, but out west, further west. And of course, out west at that time was Pennsylvania. They didn't know how far west went. They hadn't run into the real mountains yet. It's always funny when you're in Ohio, people are like, oh, the mountains right over there. I'm like, those are not mountains. Don't know what you're talking about. Anyway, but they would do that. They would ride in circus. And of course, this is not an easy thing to do. This is not a safe thing to do. This is, in fact, a very, very challenging thing to do. It's a very, very risky thing to do. You don't know how it's going to go all the time. And yet, Methodists chose to do it. And we moved ourselves further and further and further, following along where everyone else went. Because we were willing to take a risk and take a chance that others at the time were not as willing or able to do. And it was something that was done purely and completely on faith. Because it was risky and it was dangerous, and quite frankly, not all of them survived. And yet, people continued to do it. Because they recognized there were people out there who needed the word, who needed the grace, who needed the good news, and we had a calling to go and do it, whether it was safe or easy or convenient or not. Living by faith is not an invitation to live recklessly. That's not what it's about. It is about recognizing that the world doesn't always go the way we want it to, our lives don't always go the way we want it to or expect it to, and that oftentimes the plans we make and the things, the desires we have for ourselves are not entirely how things tend to actually go. That's something, no doubt, each and every one of us here has experienced. Living by faith says that no matter that despite that even when things don't go the way we expect them to or want them to, faith tells us that God is still with us. And in fact, sometimes that thing that we don't want to happen or would prefer did not happen is actually the thing we very much need to happen. The disciples did not want Jesus to go away. They did not want him to be hung on a cross. So much so that they fought it at every turn. They did not expect to find 3 days later an empty tomb with all the uncertainty that comes with. And yet, they needed that to happen. And in fact, we all needed that to happen. And we get to be here and talk about the good news and the grace and the peace and the love that comes from God because it happened. They would eventually figure that out. The disciples and the women, all those folks would go on to do tremendous, amazing work. They would find a renewed faith that probably most of us will never be blessed to know, and went literally to the ends of the earth to bring the good news to those places. I think if Wesley was here today and was seeing all of the stuff that we have to deal with, all the challenges we now face, all the uncertainty that life seems to throw at us today, his advice to all of us would be very similar to his advice 300 years ago. We are called to live by faith until we have faith, and then to live by faith. We are not to beat ourselves up for those times when our trust and our faith fails, because that's going to happen to all of us. If it can happen to those who literally spent years wandering the desert with Jesus, we can be assured it will happen to us too. And yet, even when our faith fails, God is still with us. Even when we feel uncertain, God is not. And we are continually offered the grace and peace that comes from being known as God's beloved children. So this time, especially this day of Easter day of all days, let us strive to live by faith. And if we do not have faith, let us live by it anyway until we do. Amen.